All right, everybody. So this week's Parsha is called, Beha'alatacha. Now that is a mouthful to say, Beha'alatacha. The name Beha'alatacha means in your going up. And it actually specifically refers to God is telling Aaron, the high priest, when he goes up to light the candles, he's supposed to do it in the menorah in the temple, or at this point in the tabernacle, in the Mishkan. He's supposed to do it in a very specific way, okay? So that's what it means. Beha'alatacha comes from the same root word as aliyah. Maybe you can see that the techa is your and the be is in. So you have in the middle, you have aliyah, means to go up. This week's parsha is, as I said, Beha'alatacha, which means in your going up, okay? And in this parsha, we have quite a few interesting pieces that we could look at. The first two aliyot, which is the plural for an aliyah, okay? And I'm going to explain actually in a few minutes about the dividing of each parsha, but first I'm going to tell you about this parsha. In the first two aliyot, because we have 7 aliyot in each parsha, they basically finish up God's instructions concerning the Levites, and the Levites get the Kohanim, the priests from among the Levites, get consecrated for their service in the tabernacle, in the Mishkan. The third aliyah basically talks about Passover, and specifically what to do when one is ritually impure and unable to bring a Passover sacrifice at its appropriate time. That's really interesting because, you know, this particular aliyah, it says that basically God is telling the Jewish people that from now on, at this time in the middle of the first month, you are to celebrate the Passover. And that anybody who doesn't celebrate the Passover, anybody who doesn't bring the Passover sacrifice, who was able to do so, will be cut off from his people, okay? But along come these men, and they say to Moshe, well, we were ritually impure at the time that the Passover sacrifice was, and we couldn't bring a sacrifice. And it's such a shame because we really want to be able to participate, and why can't we participate? Why should we be left out of the ability to participate simply because we were ritually impure? So Moshe goes to Hashem, and Hashem says, you know what? Because these guys really wanted to bring the sacrifice, I'm going to make a new rule. Everybody who wants to bring the Passover sacrifice but is unable to do so at the correct time because they're ritually impure, they can do it the following month. We call it Pesach Sheni. We call it the second Passover. And 1 month later, anybody who was unable to bring the Passover sacrifice at the time of the Passover sacrifice, which is the 15th or evening of 14th of the first month of the year, that they can then bring it on the second month. But, he says, and he's very clear on this, but if someone was capable of bringing the sacrifice on the day it was supposed to be brought, and they didn't for whatever reason, then they kind of lose out on their opportunity. And not only that, but they receive the punishment that is called karite. Now, karite is, we talked about this in a previous class, karite is translated as being cut off from your people, but it implies some sort of, actually more like a spiritual death. It's something that is speculated on and it's commented on, but we don't have really the specifics of what it means. All we know is that it implies something really bad. It's a really big deal. And there's only a handful of reasons that the Torah tells us that a person gets this karite, and the Torah makes it clear that basically it's the worst punishment a person can receive. That even though it's spiritual, it's not physical, it's worse than getting the death penalty, because the death penalty only destroys the physical body. But whatever this karite is, it actually destroys something spiritual, being cut off from the people, whatever that means. And so it's a really big deal. And we're told that if a person was able to bring the Passover sacrifice at the time that they were supposed to, and they weren't ritually impure and incapable of bringing it, that there are no second chances. They get this really bad punishment. And yet, if a person was unable to bring it through no fault of their own, I mean, how they became ritually impure could have been a fault of their own, but they became ritually impure. They were unable to bring the sacrifice at the time that they were supposed to, and so they get a second chance. Okay, so it's really interesting how this parsha really teaches us about this idea of second chances, and that if a person, sinned because they didn't understand or they didn't know, that there's always the opportunity to repent. There's always the opportunity to come back. There's always a second chance. Sometimes there isn't, if it was done intentionally, or in this case, I don't know, you would call it more like a sin of omission rather than a sin of commission, that they chose not to bring the sacrifice when they could have. But that receives the worst punishment of all. Okay, and then we get to the fourth Aliyah, which talks about the fact that after the tabernacle, the Mishkan, was erected, God placed a pillar of cloud over it during the day. So Hashem had the Jewish people build this temporary temple, this Mishkan, this tabernacle, which was able to be broken down and carried with them wherever they went. And last week, and the week before, in the Parsha, it kind of enumerated which families of the Levites carried what parts of the tabernacle whenever they would travel. And in the fourth Aliyah here today, we're told that God placed this pillar of cloud above the tabernacle, and that when he wanted the children of Israel to journey, the cloud would lift, and I'm assuming based on the wording that it would travel, it would lead them wherever it was that they needed to go. During the day, it was a pillar of cloud, and at night, it was a pillar of fire. So they had like this automatic night light, that they could see at night. From the wording in the Torah, you get the impression that they didn't ever travel at night, which makes sense. So the pillar of fire rested over the tabernacle at night, and the pillar of cloud rested over the tabernacle during the day. And when God wanted the children of Israel to travel, the cloud would lift and they would follow. And when it stayed put, so did they. And the children of Israel only traveled when God instructed them to do so. And in fact, in this Aliyah, it mentions sometimes they camped only overnight, sometimes it was a few nights or a few weeks or a few months, but in some instances, they actually stayed put for several years. And you'll find that it's very interesting over the next few weeks. Next week, we have the story of the spies. And then we're almost at the end. I mean, if you think about it, we're already in Bamidbar. So we're already in the fourth of the 5 books of Moses, and we've covered, all of ancient history, but as far as the Jews go, we've only covered 1 year from the Exodus from Egypt. And then over the next book and a half, and actually, I think it's over the course of a couple of chapters, we actually cover about 40 years. It's really quite interesting to look at how it works. But the fifth Aliyah enumerates how when the cloud would lift, the children of Israel would travel, and it details the order in which they traveled. It says, first it was this tribe, then it was this tribe, then it was this tribe. And every time I read about the children of Israel traveling through the wilderness, I try to envision what it must have looked like. 2 million people, plus carts and cattle. I mean, that's just like, I can't even imagine what 2 million people plus all their carts and their cattle, what it must have looked like. It's no wonder that the surrounding people that we would encounter throughout our journey were frightened of us. I mean, imagine this huge horde of people, and not just visually. I'm imagining that 2 million people plus cattle probably made a lot of noise. So now when we get to the 3rd verse of the 6th Aliyah, we read something very interesting. It says, the people were looking to complain, and it was evil in the ears of the Lord. Hashem heard, and his anger flared, and a fire from the Lord burned among them, consuming the extremes of the camp. It's like, whoa, wait a minute. These poor guys, they just came, okay, they've been in the desert now a year, but still, they're basically fresh out of Egypt, and they're complaining because, well, they're being fed this manna, which is the same thing every day, every meal. They're getting bored, right? But it says the people were looking to complain. All right. It's not that things were bad, but they were looking for bad. So they found it. When we look for bad, we find it. And when we look for good, we find that too. So, the question is, what would you prefer? Would you prefer to find good, or would you prefer to find bad? And this is a principle that is directly from the Torah. Now, I know I've shared this with you before, but it's always worth repeating. It says in Mishle, which is Proverbs, chapter 23, verse 7, as a man thinks in his heart, so he is. Right? So if you're looking for bad, you're going to find bad. And if you're looking for good, you're going to find good. You want God's blessing in your life? Look for the good, and you'll get more good. You want God's wrath? Look for something to complain about. And in fact, it's not just a matter of finding what you're looking for, but when you're looking for bad, your vision actually gets messed up, because after it says that they were looking for something to complain about, they said, and this is a quote from the passage, but the multitude among them began to have strong cravings. Then even the children of Israel once again began to cry, and they said, who will feed us meat? We remember the fish that we ate in Egypt free of charge, the cucumbers, the watermelons, the leeks, the onions, the garlics. But now our bodies are dried out, and there is nothing at all. We have nothing but manna to look at. Now, because they were looking for something to complain about, and they wanted to complain that God was providing them all the food that they needed, suddenly Egypt looked really good. And it's like I was scratching my head as I'm reading this. They talk about the fish and the other foods that they ate in Egypt free of charge. And I think to myself, wait a minute, free? Really? How quickly they forget about the cost, the pain of slavery, and how hard life was. Right? Unfortunately, this is one of the problems of living our lives in a place or from a place of fear. The children of Israel were afraid. They were afraid of the unknown. They had no idea, even though they had already been in the desert for a year, what if the manna stops? There's no food for us to eat, although that doesn't make sense because they did have cattle. But they were afraid, and fear blurs reality, as does a slave mentality. Combine the two, and you've got a really bad situation. In fact, next week's Parsha is when Hashem brings the children of Israel to the edge of the land of Israel, and they send in the spies. And a lot of people understand the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness kind of like a punishment for the 10 of the 12 spies speaking Lashon Hara, which means negative speech, about the land of Israel. And on the simple understanding of the text, it does seem to be that way. But also Hashem understood from this event, and culminating with the negative reports from the spies, that if he was going to build a holy nation in a holy land, he would not only have to take the sons of Israel out of Egypt, he would have to take Egypt out of the sons of Israel. And that's not an easy feat. That is something that would take 40 years. 40 years of depending solely on God, 40 years of being separated from every other nation and people group on earth. The 40 years in the wilderness, I believe, wasn't so much a punishment as it was a cleansing process. So then we come to the last Aliyah, okay? And it ends with a very curious story. The story ends up being one of the 6 things that we are supposed to remember every day. Now, I don't know if you recall, we went over this once before, that in the Siddur, in the prayer book, there is a page that usually I think it's after Shacharit, after the morning prayer service. It lists the 6 remembrances, and these are 6 things that we are told that we must remember every day. And they come from direct commandments from the Torah, which say that you shall remember this or that or the other, which I'll show you in a minute. I'll put up the slide. But the last Aliyah ends with this curious story. Here, Miriam, that's the sister of Aaron and Moses, okay, Miriam speaks negatively against Moshe and his wife, and she ends up contracting something called Sa'arat. Now, the word Sa'arat is usually translated in the Bible as leprosy, but it wasn't leprosy like as in the disease. It was something supernatural. It was a skin impurity that was only given to those who spoke negatively about others. Really fascinating. So here's Miriam. She spoke negatively about Moshe and about his wife, and she contracted this skin impurity, the skin disease, that made her unclean for a full week. She had to basically stay outside of the camp until it had cleared up. Now, there's lots and lots and lots written about what we can learn from Tza'arat. And, one of the things is that if a person had Tza'arat, they had to be separated from the rest of the community, had to live outside the camp. And, it was supposed to be a time for them to reflect on what they had done wrong. And if they got it, then they would clear up and they would immerse in the pool and the ritual waters, and then they would become part of the community again. But if it didn't clear up, if they didn't get it, if they didn't figure out why they had contracted it in the first place, then they would end up staying unclean for much longer. And it's really interesting because way back a bunch of chapters ago when they were talking about Tza'arat, and I think the parsha that it's mostly featured in is called Mitzora or Tazria. One or the other of those, they're next to each other. It talks about how if somebody is completely covered, then they end up being declared clean, because basically what it means is that they just so don't get it that there's no healing for them. Basically, this is just the way it is. And, the purpose of the Tza'arat was to get the person to think about what they had done and to change their way. So the 6 remembrances, which are listed, there are 2 very important Jewish principles that we get from this passage about Miriam speaking Lashon Hara against Moshe and his wife. And the first one is how incredibly important it is that we don't speak Lashon Hara, which means negative speech, against anyone. It's so important that we're told by the sages that this is one of the things that we must remember every day, right? And in fact, here are the 6 things that we're commanded. They're on the screen there. We're commanded to remember every day our exodus from Egypt. We're commanded to remember every day the revelation at Sinai. We're commanded every day to remember Amalek's attack against Israel. And part of the reason for that is not only to understand that we'll always be under attack and that God is constantly fighting Amalek, but also to remind us that we need to be on our guard, that we don't leave those who are struggling at the rear unprotected from attack, which is a whole nother lesson altogether. I give a whole talk on that. But we also need to remember the rebellion in the desert, and we need to remember Miriam's negative speech against Moshe, and we need to remember Shabbat. So those are the 6 things that we're supposed to remember every single day. Every single day, we're supposed to remember those 6 things. All right? So the first principle that we have to learn from the whole story about Miriam was that it's wrong to speak Lashon Hara. But the second one is that we are not supposed to embarrass another person. In fact, the Gemara relates that embarrassing another person is equivalent to basically killing them. That's what it says. Now, we've just gone through the 7 aliyot for this week's parsha, and I'm going to get back to what the Gemara says about not embarrassing somebody in a minute, but it's related to what I'm about to tell you now. Okay, so we just breezed through those 7 aliyot for this week's parsha, but I want to do a little bit of review about what the parsha is, about the parshas, okay? So just a quick reminder, each week we read a part of the Torah, which is called the parsha. Right? The whole Torah is divided up into basically 54 pieces, and each piece is called a parsha. And each parsha is divided into 7 aliyot. An aliyah means to go up. And for each aliyah, a different person is called up to read from the Torah, and he's given an honor of reading it. Now, in ancient times, each person who was called up read the aliyah for himself. However, at some point it was decided that the reading itself would be done by a person who is considered basically a professional Torah reader, okay? And this is somebody who can do it really well and who can do it without mistakes. This way, people can be honored with being called up to the Torah, even if they're not capable of reading it themselves. This is really important. It avoids embarrassing anybody, either through their less than adequate reading or by the necessity of not giving an honor because they can't read from the Torah correctly. So for example, let's say a man has just recently become religious and he gets engaged to be married, right? So it's traditional in the synagogue to give the new bridegroom an aliyah to the Torah, to give him an honor and celebration of his very special news. But what if he's, newly religious or he can't read at all? And, how do you give him an honor, but you don't want to embarrass him, right? Because maybe he can't read. So that's why they instituted this concept that the one person reads all of the aliyot. So this person makes the bracha, then they announce who's being called up to the Torah. The person who's being given the honor makes a couple of other brachas over the reading of the Torah, and then the professional guy does the reading. Now, for a bar mitzvah, the bar mitzvah boy is the one who does the reading, and that's why it takes a full year, sometimes more than that, for him to learn how to properly read his parsha from the Torah. So, like, let's say we know that, let's say I have a son who's going to be bar mitzvahed basically 1 year from now, okay? So we know, by looking at the calendar, that his parsha, his bar mitzvah parsha is going to be Behalatacha, which is good, because better than it should be Naso, which was last week's, which is basically the longest parsha in the entire Torah. It's very, very long. I think it's 176 verses or something like that. So anyway, so what happens is from now until his bar mitzvah, he will study every week with a professional Torah reader to learn how to read the cantillation marks, to learn how to read the words, because the Torah doesn't have vowels. So you have to read the Hebrew without the vowels. So that means that really you have to know what every word is. Okay, you don't have to memorize it because you can read it from the Torah, but there's an element of memorizing that has to go on, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to read it. And so the bar mitzvah boy will begin 1 year before his bar mitzvah. Like I said, sometimes it's a little less, sometimes it's much more, practicing the reading of his parsha so that he will be able to read it when he is bar mitzvah. So what will happen is basically on his bar mitzvah, unless there's a reason not to do it, and some boys with learning disabilities or other extenuating circumstances perhaps are very shy, they may not actually do the reading, and that's okay too. But boys who are normal intelligence, not special needs, who can learn it, they will basically take the place of this professional Torah reader. So they will, okay, so the point was that by having a professional reader, this avoids embarrassing anyone, either because they can't read properly or because they wouldn't be able to get the honor because they can't read. So for example, my husband, who is a convert, he does not read very well. I mean, he can read, he can pray from the Siddur, but he doesn't really read well enough, certainly not to read from the Torah. And so if we were back in the times when the person given the honor was expected to read from the Torah, he would never be given an honor. And eventually people will notice that, and it becomes an embarrassment. And so here again, we see the emphasis on this very important principle in Judaism, that you should never cause another person embarrassment. The writers of the Talmud took this prohibition extremely seriously. And in just a minute, we're going to take a look at what it says in the Talmud. But it is believed that the concept is based on 3 verses from the Tanakh, actually from the Torah. Okay? So in Vayikra, which is, Vayikra is Leviticus, sorry. In Vayikra, Leviticus chapter 25, verse 17, it says, "So you shall not wrong another, but you shall fear your God, for I am Hashem, your God." Now, of course, the term to wrong another is open to interpretation, but the Mishnah, Bava Metzia, says that this applies to words as well as to money. There are, of course, many ways to wrong another with words, but embarrassing another is for sure one way of transgressing this prohibition. Then we read again in Vayikra, Leviticus chapter 19, verse 17, "You shall not hate your fellow countrymen in your heart. You may surely reprove your neighbor, but you shall not incur sin because of him." So here we have a commandment not to hate, but giving permission to rebuke another who needs it. And yet it says that you shall not incur sin because of him. Well, what does that mean? So this passage warns us not to allow the fulfillment of this commandment to simultaneously cause a transgression of humiliating another person. The prohibition against embarrassing in this specific case creates a general prohibition against embarrassing in any situation, right? And then in the verse after this, in Vayikra chapter 19, verse 18, we're told that we shall love our neighbor as ourselves. And it is taught that embarrassing another violates the commandment to love our neighbor as ourselves. Most of the time we try not to embarrass ourselves in public, right? All right, so what does the Talmud have to say about this? Well, I don't have a slide for you, so you'll just have to bear with me, but it says in Bava Metzia 58b, "He who publicly shames his neighbor, it is as though he has shed blood." All right? Secondly, it says verbal wrong is more heinous than monetary wrong. Think about that for a second. Many of us would never steal or cheat somebody financially, but talking about another person just kind of slides off our tongue without us even thinking about it. And yet, the Gemara teaches us that the speaking negatively about another person is actually way worse than cheating them financially. All right? The third thing it says is that it is better for a man to cohabit with a doubtful married woman rather than that he should publicly shame his neighbor. In other words, publicly shaming somebody is a bigger sin than having an affair. All right? Now that's saying a lot because there's a death penalty for having an affair, right? So it's a big deal. All right, 4 rather, it says better to throw oneself into a furnace rather than embarrass another. That's also from Bava Metzia. 5, it says, there was a poor person in the time of the Talmud, and Mar Ukva, whoever he is, would daily leave coins behind the poor man's door. One day, the poor man wanted to find out who had been leaving coins for him, so he waited until Mar Ukva and his wife stopped by and dropped off the coins. The pauper tried to follow them. When Mar Ukva noticed that he was being followed, he ran with his wife and hid in a hot furnace so as not to embarrass the man. Okay? So that is why it said in Bava Metzia, better to throw oneself into a furnace than to embarrass another person. And then Rabbeinu Yonah, in his famous work, Gates of Repentance, explains that the pain of shame is worse than death itself. So, as you see, it is such an important principle in Judaism not to embarrass another person, that the Torah reading procedure was adjusted to eliminate the possibility of embarrassing someone, certainly as much as humanly possible. In addition to having a professional reader do this, they designated that the first aliyah will always be given to a Kohen and the second to a Levi. This order was ordained in order to avoid public competition for the honor of being first. So again, what that did was it minimized the amount of embarrassment that could occur, since you always have to have a Kohen do the first aliyah. And if the synagogue doesn't have a Kohen, then it goes to a Levi. But it's really interesting because if you have a synagogue that only has one Kohen, which is very rare, it almost never happens, but if you have a synagogue that only has one Kohen, then guess what? He gets the first aliyah every time. But it's not, nobody's embarrassed about it or feels bad about it because the rule is that the Kohen gets the first aliyah. All right. Now, since speaking Lashon Hara against another person always causes embarrassment, there are serious consequences for doing so. Now, for whatever reason, God saw fit to stop causing tza'arat to those who speak Lashon Hara. I don't know at what time that punishment stopped appearing, but for whatever reason, it did. And we can only speculate as to why. Nobody knows why. But for sure, there are very serious spiritual consequences for speaking Lashon Hara and doing so. And we are told to remember Miriam's Lashon Hara every day in order to help us try to remember not to speak negative speech against another person. If you want to learn more, oh, and just another note, by the way, sometimes you'll read things in Jewish commentaries that say that certain things are forbidden against another Jew, but not necessarily against a non-Jew. Now, part of the reasons for these things appearing in the Talmud, you have to put it into the context of the days. I mean, Jewish people, the Jewish people have always been persecuted by the surrounding nations. And so a lot of the things that people will now quote out of context that the Gemara says about how, like, you're not allowed to cheat a Jew, but you can cheat a non-Jew. Sounds terrible, right? Well, again, if you put it in the context of the time that it was written, it makes a lot more sense. But there are many rabbis who teach that even though technically that is okay, for example, we are forbidden from speaking gossip or Lashon Hara against another Jew, technically you're not forbidden from doing it against a non-Jew. However, the rabbis teach that we should not get into the habit of speaking negative speech against anyone, even if it's permissible, because of what it does to our own soul, because of how it will condition us to be more likely to speak it in the future. Okay? So we should never get into the habit of speaking Lashon Hara. Now, if you want to learn more about the laws against speaking Lashon Hara, what constitutes Lashon Hara, and under what circumstances you are actually permitted to speak negative speech, I really highly recommend the Chofetz Chaim is a book, the Chofetz Chaim, A Lesson a Day. As I was saying, if you want to learn more about the laws of speaking against speaking Lashon Hara, I highly recommend this book, Chofetz Chaim, A Lesson a Day. Okay, now Rabbi Yisrael Meir HaKohen Kagan was born in 1838 in Poland. And as students started to flock from all over Europe to learn with him, his home ended up becoming what is known as the Radin Yeshiva. Okay, this was in Poland. And he was primarily known for his teachings on the laws of negative speech, or Lashon Hara. And his first book he called the Sefer Chofetz Chaim, okay, which was about the laws of Lashon Hara. And it was published in 1873, and that is how he was eventually known. It's not uncommon in Judaism for great rabbis who write like a really significant book to be called by the name of the book. If I had had more time, I would have thought of other examples for you. There are a lot of them. But in this case, the Chofetz Chaim, Rabbi Kagan had written this book called the Chofetz Chaim, or the Chafetz Chaim, actually. It's just a different form of the same word. And Chafetz Chaim means he who desires life. Okay, and it comes from the verse in Tehillim, Psalms 34, chapter 34, verses 13 through 14. In the Christian Bible, I think it's 12 and 13 instead of 13 and 14. But the verse says, "Who is the man who desires life and loves length of days, that he may see good? Keep your tongue from evil and your lips from speaking deceit." Okay, so the book is called Chofetz Chaim, and they took basically the contents of his book, and it was edited and divided up into basically 180 or so daily readings, so that you can study one piece every day, and it takes about 6 months to get through the whole book. Each year, my husband spends half the year reviewing the laws of Lashon Hara. It's that important. And yet, although it's considered one of the most important laws, most people violate it. Even those of us who try not to, usually end up doing it at least a little bit, okay? So unfortunately, oftentimes, if you point out to someone that they're speaking Lashon Hara, and because of the laws of not embarrassing someone, you have to be careful how you do that. But usually if you say to somebody, I don't want to hear that, or I don't believe that, or I can't listen to that, or I think that that might be Lashon Hara, people will take offense in a way that they don't take offense regarding any other laws or other sins that you might point out. It's amazing to watch how really upset people will get, not because they spoke Lashon Hara, but because you told them that they were speaking Lashon Hara. People are actually like addicted to talking about other people, and specifically in a negative way. If you think about it, to never say anything negative about another person, it's quite a discipline. But my husband and my son-in-law happen to be extremely disciplined in this area, and I'm trying. I'm not so great, but I do try. I do make an effort. So depending on the details and who you're talking about and different things like that, apparently the rabbis have determined that speaking Lashon Hara, you can, depending on the circumstances, end up breaking 17 Torah commandments. 17. Homosexuality is 1 or maybe 2. But speaking negative speech about somebody could add up to 17 violations of the Torah. It's that important. So I highly recommend, if you can get a hold of this book, please do, and work your way through it. It will change your life. Because the thing is that, you know, it's a major principle in Judaism that our words are very powerful, right? We've talked about that a gazillion times. Our words are extremely powerful, and they create reality. And if we speak negatively about another person, we are bringing more negativity into the world and into our lives in particular. And who needs to create more negativity in their lives, right? Now, just one last note about the Chofetz Chaim. He wrote a total of 21 books during his 70 years of life, including what is called the Mishnah Berurah. The Mishnah Berurah is a commentary on the Orech Chaim, which is the first section of the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch is a compendium of Jewish law, and his book, the Mishnah Berurah, has been accepted universally among Ashkenazi Jews as an authoritative source of halacha. So this guy was pretty important and very well revered, and not so ancient either. I mean, we're talking about, 1800s? So fairly recent history. So a lot of what he says is very, very relevant. Okay, moving on to the prayers. Okay, last week we looked at the prayer called Elokai Neshama, right? We talked about why I say Elokai instead of Elohai, right? And it's considered part of the morning blessings. Now we're going to start making our way through the part of the morning blessings, which is often referred to in and of itself as the morning blessings. It's a series of blessings that is part of these morning prayers. When we get up, we have several prayers which are said before anybody ever goes to Shacharit. Now, most women do not go to Shacharit in the mornings during the week. Many do on Shabbat, but most do not during the week. And in fact, most synagogues are really not set up for the women to participate during the week. Why is that? Because men are required to pray in a minyan, which is a group of 10 Jewish men, 3 times a day. Women do not have that requirement. Women, depending on who you read and which authority you're reading, women do have a requirement to pray, but they are not required to pray in a minyan. And part of that has to do with the understanding by our sages that women are more spiritually connected than men. It's very interesting because depending on how you read things, you know, you always interpret everything that you read through your own lenses. And there are a lot of people who say that Judaism is very chauvinist and it's very like anti-woman. And to be honest, there are some segments which, if you observe the way that they treat women, you would come to that conclusion. But that's not how women are referred to if you look at the writings of the sages. Now, there are a lot of things that are said about separating men and women so that people don't get themselves in trouble. And sometimes the way that it's couched can make it sound very like anti-woman, but it's not. Judaism teaches that the woman is what influences the observance of the home. That's why Jewishness is transferred through the mother, not through the father, even though tribal lineage comes through the father. And we are taught by the sages that women are more spiritually connected, and therefore they don't need the force of being in a group in order to connect with God in the same way that men seem to need it. All right? So before the men go off to synagogue to daven shacharit, which is the morning prayer service, there are a bunch of preliminary prayers that are supposed to be said before they ever go to synagogue. And in fact, even though, for example, you're allowed to drink coffee or have something to eat before you pray the morning prayer service, if you need the food in order to be able to make it through the prayer service. I know that my husband cannot make it through shacharit unless he at least has a cup of coffee. But the men are supposed to say these preliminary prayers before they even have their coffee so that they can go to shul. So it means that they have to plan, that extra 10 minutes, 15 minutes into their morning routine so that they can pray these things before they go to shul. Now, most authorities hold that if a woman can, she should pray these prayers also as a minimum. She's not required to go to synagogue, but the morning brachot she is supposed to pray unless she just can't because she's got a bunch of little kids around or whatever, and she's just not capable of setting aside that time. But women who don't have children yet or who are older and all of their children are grown, there's no reason for them not to say morning brachot. It only takes about 10 or 15 minutes, and it's a good way to start the day. There are many days when I don't have time to pray all of shacharit, but I will pray the morning brachot. I will do the Shema and the paragraphs after the Shema, and I will do the Amidah, the Shemona Esrei, the standing prayer, which we'll get into hopefully in a few weeks, months, maybe. We'll see if we ever get there. But, okay, so these preliminary prayers include Modeh Ani, which we went over. That was one of the first things we did, right? That's the first prayer we looked at. And Reshit Chachma, which means the beginning of wisdom, that follows Modeh Ani. We looked at the prayer for washing the hands, the Asher Yatzar, which is the prayer after going to the bathroom. And for men, this preliminary section also includes the prayers for putting on tefillin and tzitzit, which we talked about last week, and why women don't wear them. And it includes the prayers for reading the Torah, because as we discussed last week, or actually 2 weeks ago, but as we discussed the last time, it's said here because many of the prayers that we say contain quotes from the Torah. So before we start reading all of these prayers, which may contain quotes from the Torah, we say the blessing on reading the Torah before we go in any further in our prayers. Right? Then we have Elokai Neshama, which we did last week, followed by the series of blessings, each thanking God for the various forms in which he created us. And now we're going to get started on going through those one by one. Okay. So the first of these morning brachas says, Baruch Atah Hashem. Of course, if you're actually praying it, you say Hashem's name. Elokeinu melech haolam asher natan l'shechvi bina lahavchin bein yom ubein laila. Okay, literally that means, blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who gave the heart understanding to distinguish between day and night. Okay? These are the prayers that we say when we get up in the morning. Now, it may be interesting to note that in some siddurs, you may find a slightly different translation. That is, blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who gave the rooster understanding to distinguish between night and day. You see, the word shechvi actually means both heart and rooster. Now, the word for heart that most of us are familiar with is lev, but shechvi apparently also means heart. And translating the blessing here, either one actually makes sense. Now, we're taught in Judaism that each animal on earth can teach us something about how we're supposed to conduct ourselves. It's said that the cat, for example, teaches us modesty. Now, when I first heard this, I thought it was I found it kind of hard to believe, because we've had cats as pets pretty much our entire married lives, which is coming up on 30 years this fall. I'm about to celebrate my 30th wedding anniversary. Can you believe it? But if you've ever watched a cat, you know that they can sometimes be found in positions that would hardly qualify as modest. So why did the sages say that we can learn modesty from a cat? Because of the fact that a cat usually makes in private and then covers up their waist when they're done. Okay, I suppose I can accept that. So here we have this blessing about distinguishing between night and day. And we have this word, shechvi, which could be translated as heart, or it could be translated as rooster. Have any of you ever had any chickens? I have chickens right now. I currently have 4 hens, and I have recently acquired 17 chicks. I have 17 because I want to have a dozen egg-laying hens, and I don't know how many of them are male and how many of them are female, so time will tell on that one. But it should be fairly soon because they are growing at an incredible rate. But besides enjoying getting my organic free-range eggs, I also enjoy watching these chickens. And one of the first things I learned from my chickens is that chickens have this incredible internal clock that goes according to the sun, and it is indeed like clockwork. In fact, you can use this to your advantage when you have to do things with the chickens. Shortly before sunset, they all go up into their coop and they get on their perch and they go to sleep. When the sun rises, they're all up and ready for the day. Now, because they practically shut down at night, if you need to do anything with them, that's a good time, for example, to transport them. Because if you pick them up and put them in a bag to transport them somewhere, they're asleep, so they're not going to be quite as upset. I don't know. That doesn't kind of make sense because I know with a human being, I'd be a whole lot more upset if you woke me up. But anyway, so that's a good time to do it. And I was told that, for example, if I want to let my hens out of the run, in other words, let's say I want to just let them run around my yard and eat the weeds and stuff like that, what you do is you do it shortly before sundown, because they'll wander around, but they can't get very far if you let them out shortly before sundown. And at sundown, like clockwork, they will all head back to the coop. They shut down at night, and this is where they sleep, so it works very well. You let them out, they get a little bit, they go a little far, and then they all go back into their coop, and not a problem. They're not going to go that far because they're going to want to get back into their coop at night because they know that that's where they sleep. Okay, so they shut down at night. Now roosters, though, have this thing that they do when the sun rises, right? They crow. And the truth is, being around roosters all the time over the past year, I can tell you that they crow all day long. They do not just crow when the sun rises. They start crowing when the sun rises, but they do not just crow when the sun rises. They start when the sun rises, and then they crow all day long as the sun is up. But at sunset, just like the hens, they climb up into the coop and they shut down like someone is flipping a switch. The only time that you will hear a rooster crowing at night is if they're in an area where there are a lot of lights on at night. For example, if you live in a city, or if the farm keeps a lot of the lights on, then their body gets all confused and they will crow at night. This confusion will also shorten their lifespan because just like humans, they need that darkness so that they really can shut down and get the rest that their bodies need. So here in this prayer, it says that God gives the rooster the ability to differentiate between night and day. It's automatic. God clearly created them this way. And human beings are very similar, not only in that we need not only in that we need actual darkness to sleep well and be healthy, which we do, by the way, but studies have shown that having too much light in your room at night inhibits your body's production of certain chemicals which are only produced in the darkness and which are absolutely necessary for your body to recuperate while you sleep and to wake up refreshed. So, just like if you sit at your computer late at night, you will stay up a lot later because of the light from the computer screen. So if you're trying to adjust your sleeping schedule so that you go to sleep earlier, what you need to do is shut down your computer a half an hour to an hour before you actually want to go to bed so that your body will be able to withdraw from that light and be able to begin to shut down. All right, but also human beings, we associate darkness with things hidden and scary. and even evil, right? We talk about bringing light into the darkness, and we understand that in the light, everything is seen and is known, and that it is in the darkness that things that are wrong are done under the cover of night. We, as human beings, naturally distinguish between darkness and light, and the heart understands that distinction. So when we say this blessing, we are both thanking God for the physical differences between day and night and our ability to adjust and make use of them, but also for the blessing of being able to differentiate, period. While it's true that it was the curse of Adam eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil that ostensibly gave us the ability to make this discernment, at the same time, the ability to distinguish between good and evil is by definition free will. If one cannot discern between good and evil and therefore cannot choose good, because good is the default, then one has no free will. That's the state of the angels. The angels have no free will. They only do as God commands them to do. And while this may seem to be the ideal, it means that they cannot love God either. Think about it. Love is an action born of a choice. If there is no choice, it's not love. It may be obedience, it may be worship, but it's not love. And God wanted us to love him, so he gave us the ability to make a choice. That is a reason to thank God. He didn't create us as automatons, but rather he gave us free will to choose to love him and obey or choose not to. It's up to us. And as we awake to another day to choose whether or not we will serve him this day, we thank him that he gave us the ability to make that choice. For the rooster, it's automatic, but for us, there's a choice. So, blessed are you, Lord our God, who gave the heart understanding to distinguish between night and day, between right and wrong, between honesty and deceit. Okay, so I am going to stop sharing the screen, and because of the way I had my thing, I didn't see the note that I got from Vera. She said, shalom to everybody from Pakistan. All right, does anybody have any statements about what we were talking about? Any questions? You want to have a discussion? Please feel free to unmute yourself. On your picture at the bottom left-hand side, you should see a microphone with it will have a red line on it. You can click it and you can talk. Anybody? I love Jan's famous quote from a couple of weeks ago where she said, you can unmute us, but you can't make us talk. So yeah, I'm going to give you one more chance. Anybody have anything they want to share, say, discuss? It's good to see you all here again this week. Rivka, are you going to say something? I can't hear you. You have to unmute. Okay, now you're unmuted.
Can you hear me now? Can you still see me?
Yeah.
Okay.
No,
I was going to show you my copy of the Chofetz Chaim.
Okay, so I don't see you anymore. Your video seems to have disappeared.
My video disappeared.
But
How about now?
You are. There you are. Okay.
Okay, so I was going to show you this book, which Rabbi Jovitz sent me. Is it the same?
It's got the same information. It's just not divided up the same way, and it might not have the same commentary, but it's covering the same like topic. You know, I mean, his work is his work, and so it's going to be the same thing. The thing I like about the Chofetz Chaim lesson a day, and the truth is if you go to the Chofetz Chaim Foundation, you can Google that. It might actually be available online for free. They do a lot of free resources because they feel that it's extremely important for everybody to learn and obtain this information. They're less about making a profit than they are about wanting to educate people. So I know that for a while I was getting a daily email from them. And so you can sign up for that at the Chofetz Chaim Foundation website. And you may be able to download a PDF of the lesson a day is the book that I just like the way it's broken up into small edible chunks So you can say, okay, I'm going to sit for 5 minutes every day, either in the morning or before I go to bed or at lunchtime or whatever. I'm going to sit for 5 minutes and I'm going to read something from one of the lessons from the Chofetz Chaim. And that way you can go through it on a regular basis. And like I said, my husband does it. He does it for 6 months, and then in 6 months he does it again. And so every year he reviews it once, but you can do it twice a year if you want, because it's a 6 month devotional. But yeah, cool. All right. Anybody else?
Janine, I have a question.
Yeah.
I know last week you were talking about women were not obligated to wrap tefillin, but if you feel like you've done all the other mitzvahs that you need to do, that you can. Is it the same thing for being called up for an aliyah?
No.
More conservative shuls, women do go up to the bima, but
right, but not in Orthodox. In the Orthodox synagogue, the gender roles are much more strictly defined. And so in an Orthodox synagogue, only men are called up for an aliyah, but it's considered that if they're married, they're representing their wife. And at the end of their aliyah, at the end of their being called up, when they make the blessings afterwards, the guy who's in charge, the gabbai, will ask him for the name of his wife and the name of his children, and they will basically say a prayer for his wife and his children. So the wife is being included in the calling up, which is something that's very hard for modern women to kind of reconcile in their heads, because the way that modern women think, they tend to feel like it means that they're being left out. But the truth is that there is so much else that women are included in Judaism. And so most of us who have been involved in it for a very long time, all of our life, this is just a part of the way things are done. The minyan is specifically required for the man, and so all of the little pieces that are involved in it are requirements for the man, and the women are not necessarily involved in it. Now, for example, at Purim, we read from the book of Esther, right? And so in many communities, even very Orthodox communities, they will have a separate minyan for women, and women will read from the Megillah. And so it gives them an opportunity to participate without pulling the men away. See, this is a phenomenon, and I observed this way before I was Jewishly observant. Many, many years ago, when I was involved in Christianity, I went on a mission trip to a country in Central America, and we would go and we would hold Bible school, vacation Bible school for, the kids and stuff like that. And one of the things that we noticed in Christianity was that the churches were much more highly attended by women than by men, because, as Judaism has observed, women are much more spiritual. Just naturally, we're more drawn to religion. We have a much more, our connection with God is much easier to make. And so Judaism recognized this and instituted a lot of these things, these requirements, these laws that apply only to the men, in order to get the men there and to help them to connect. Because the women will connect regardless of whether or not we have these rituals and these rules that we have to do. We're going to connect with God anyway, because we're very relational. We're always seeking relationship, whereas men are much less so. And as hard as we try to equalize things, there are scientific studies that show that men and women have differently wired brains. Doesn't mean one's better than the other, or, whatever, but we're different. And, that's because we have different hormones rushing through our body. We have different organs inside our bodies. And so we connect with God in very different ways. And what men need and what women need are a little bit different. So I hope that kind of paints a picture that's a little bit more complete of why. But in the Orthodox synagogue, women are not called up to, they're not given an aliyah to the Torah. Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions, anybody? No? Okay. So if, oh, did I hear somebody? No? Okay, so just one last reminder. I'm sorry I keep plugging this, but I have started the conversion program with Rabbi Riskin. I actually haven't done any of the recordings yet. I'll be starting to make recordings next week. But, and I have everything on the website set up except for the actual application. But if you know anybody who's interested in doing an online conversion program, they can go to teshuva.com. That's TESHUVAH.com and click on conversion program, and the information is there. And God willing, this week I'll get the application actually up so that people can start the process. So thank you everybody for joining me this week. It was so good to see all of you, and I'm looking forward to working our morning brachot over the course of the next few weeks. And I will see you next week. Take care, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Minia.
Good.
From Pakistan. I'm Mrs. Farah Sajid, calling from Pakistan.
Ah, yes.
And good to see you live, and you are so good. So good, so goodly talk everything, not doubt, everything you told about Torah, about our spiritual talk you are talking is great.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for joining us. I'm looking forward to having you.
Thank you so much.
Okay, everybody, have a good night.